back to debate on the question. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to begin by stating I'm delivering my remarks on Treaty 1 territory and in the homeland of the Métis Nation here in Manitoba. As a Canadian and as a member of Parliament, the oath of citizenship of Canada is something I deeply respect. The proposed Liberal amendment to the Citizenship Act is something to which Conservatives have given much thought and consideration. The amendment under debate today represents a historic step forward in Canada's relationship with its Indigenous peoples and an important component of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. In my remarks, I will discuss my personal experiences with Indigenous history and the Canadian Oath of Citizenship. I will also highlight the profound significance of the purpose of the words of the Oath of Citizenship and the equally profound significance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I will also include discussions with the contrasting Conservative and Liberal positions on these important matters. And in conclusion, I do believe that Bill C-8 importantly and necessarily elevates the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and our treaties with them to the institutionally symbolic affirmation of patriotism and loyalty that is our oath of citizenship. I want to begin by sharing that my personal journey of understanding the realities faced by Indigenous peoples and their history in Canada did not really begin in a fulsome way until later in my life, whereas today children are learning about Indigenous history much earlier in their education. And frankly, the only learning experience I had before adulthood about Indigenous history came in high school when I first learned of Helen Betty Osborne, the 19-year-old Cree woman who lived in the Pas, Manitoba, where she was abducted, beaten, stabbed over 50 times with a screwdriver, and killed. It took 16 years to solve her case, and it was later found that racism, sexism, and indifference from those who had power over her case was the cause of the 16-year delay in justice. The provincial government of Manitoba formally apologized for this injustice in 2000. Following this experience, I went on to study political science at McGill University and the University of Manitoba. And during that time, my understanding of Canadian Indigenous history was further expanded. I was fortunate to study under Professor Nagan Sinclair, who happens to be the son of Senator Murray Sinclair, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Although our policies and our politics don't always align, I learned a great deal from Professor Sinclair about Indigenous history and took advantage of Canada's largest Native Studies faculty located at the University of Manitoba. Shortly before the completion of my undergraduate degree, I realized I had sufficient credits to graduate with a Canadian history minor, save for one issue. The McGill criteria for Canadian history did not permit the inclusion of Native studies as part of the Canadian history minor requirements. I felt that this was an injustice, considering Native studies is, of course, the study of Canadian history. And as a result, I made the formal request to McGill University to change its requirements to consider Native studies Canadian history. And they agreed, and I graduated with a Canadian history minor, and it is my expectation that McGill students have been permitted to do the same ever since. I mention these events, Mr. Speaker, because they had a profound impact on me as a young woman. They laid bare just how far Canada and its institutions must travel on this journey of reconciliation. The inclusion of 19 additional words through Bill C-8 to our country's short but profound oath of citizenship is another important step on this important journey. That is why Conservatives will be supporting this bill. I have had very positive experiences with the Oath of Citizenship. In fact, those experiences stand out in memory with their deeply historic Canadian traditions and all the pomp and circumstance that comes with them. I will never forget the first citizenship ceremony I ever witnessed. It was a very hot summer day in Manitoba, and I was attending the ceremony as the head aide for the Manitoba Minister of Culture. The ceremony was officiated by Dwight Macaulay, the former Chief of Protocol of the Manitoba Legislature. He spoke so eloquently to the soon-to-be Canadian citizens about the significance of Canadian citizenship and the hope it provided to all of them in their new roles as citizens of Canada. The people there were of many different ages, races, and religions, and they were absolutely beaming with pride to be there on this very special day. Some even shed tears of joy after they had taken the oath of citizenship. I remember feeling very patriotic in that moment. And to that point, citizenship was something that I had really taken for granted, having always had it. But I felt very fortunate that I got to witness such a profound moment in the lives of those new Canadian citizens. Mr. Speaker, as we debate changing the oath of citizenship today, I believe it is important for us to recognize the rich history of Canada's Westminster-style democracy to provide context to its sanctity of the oath and the profound importance it has on Canadian culture. It is deeply symbolic and rooted in customs and traditions that have evolved since the first English Parliament was convened in 1215 with the creation of the signing of the Magna Carta. Canadian democracy and the freedoms and stability we enjoy are a result of over 800 years of that development of our governing institutions. As a result, our customs and traditions are deeply embedded in the fabric of what it means to be Canadian. And that is why the second reading debate today on Bill C-8, an act to amend the Citizenship Act, Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action number 94 is so important. The Oath of Allegiance makes up the first portion of our Oath of Citizenship. The Oath of Allegiance is taken by all those who wish to become judges, policemen and women, members of the Canadian Armed Forces, people who have been elected to serve in Parliament and provincial legislatures, and others. And what is the Oath of Citizenship, you may ask? It is a powerful, historical, solemn declaration of fealty to the Canadian monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, who is the personification of the Canadian state. The oath we use in Canada has its roots, in fact, taken from an oath from the United Kingdom, which was first implemented in 1689 by King William II. I recently took the oath of allegiance to the Queen as part of the process to be officially sworn in as a Canadian Member of Parliament. It was a short but hugely symbolic phrase that reminded me of the seriousness and obligations and responsibilities I was about to assume. I rested my hand on a Bible and swore under my name that I, quote, will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. When members of Parliament swear these words, we are swearing allegiance to the institution the Queen represents, which includes our Westminster-style democracy, and when we swear this oath, we are pledging to conduct ourselves in the best interests of Canada. Our obligations as MPs to swear the oath of allegiance dates back to the Constitution Act of 1867. However, the oath of citizenship, which was adapted from the oath of allegiance, came as a mandatory requirement for citizens many years later. It was not until 1946 that Canada's House of Commons passed the Canadian Citizenship Act, which officially established the creation of Canadian citizenship. And interestingly, the oath of citizenship in Canada only became law when the Citizenship Act was amended in 1977, which was 110 years after Confederation, and it marked the introduction of the symbolic affirmation of patriotism and loyalty into our oath of citizenship. Bill C-8 represents the first change to our oath of citizenship in over 40 years. Given the history and symbolic significance I have just highlighted, this amendment to the citizenship oath is, to put it plainly, a very big deal. In sum, the oath of citizenship connects new Canadians to our constitutional monarch, who embodies our government institutions in a timeless way, and by doing so, it brings people into the historic Canadian identity. The oath of citizenship in its current form is as follows. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. Bill C-8 adds 19 words to our oath, and they are as follows. That I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. By including the historic amendment to include Indigenous and treaty rights in our oath of citizenship, it elevates and signifies the inherent dignity of Indigenous peoples and the agreements that were made with them, and informs newcomers of the Canadian commitment to both our national duty and allegiance to the Queen of Canada, as well as our commitment to truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Given our discussion today on Bill C-8, it is, of course, important that we include mention of the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was activated by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper and organized by those involved with the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. The purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to document the historical impact and the lasting legacy of the Canadian and Indian residential school system on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. There are more than 130 residential schools in Canada, and 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were subjected to them. And 7 generations of Indigenous Canadians were impacted by residential schools. More than 6,000 witnesses were interviewed during the commission. They shared their stories, the horrors and abuse they faced, including sexual abuse that was inflicted on them during their time in residential schools. We have learned that 3,200 children died of tuberculosis, malnutrition, and other diseases while attending these schools. Many Indigenous parents were never informed of the deaths of their children. To them, their children were simply taken from them, never to be seen again. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. The mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, as its name is, telling the truth about what happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada, notably the horrific abuse and forced cultural assimilation of Indigenous children in residential schools, as well as the failure of over 150 years of federal governments to fulfill treaty rights that were agreed to in partnership with Indigenous peoples in good faith. Senator Murray Sinclair has said that, quote, the process of reconciliation follows and involves educating the broader Canadian public on the truth and asking the public to accept that there are more things that need to be done to reconcile with Indigenous peoples. Mr. Speaker, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we understand that residential schools are one of the defining factors of why Indigenous people continue to suffer disproportionately in Canada. 1 in 4 Indigenous peoples live in poverty, and 40% of Indigenous children live in poverty. The 2016 Canadian census found that over 33% of Indigenous Canadians do not have a high school education or equivalent certificate, compared to 18% of the rest of Canada's population. Further, Indigenous people have historically faced much higher unemployment rates than non-Indigenous Canadians. Moreover, the number of Indigenous people in federal prisons has never been higher, with more than 30% of all federal inmates identifying as Indigenous, despite making up only 4.3% of the Canadian population. Tragically, suicide rates are 5 to 7 times higher for First Nations youth compared to non-Indigenous youth, and the situation is even more dire for Inuit youth. One more minute, thank you. Which have the highest suicide rates in the world, 11 times higher than the Canadian national average. It's really unbelievable, actually. In fact, suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for First Nations youth and adults up to 44 years old. And shamefully, we know that in Canada, Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to go missing or be murdered than other Canadian women. When considering these statistics and many others, it is clear the policies put forth by the centuries of governments have failed Indigenous Canadians. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is significant, symbolic, and a historic effort to move past the Ottawa knows best approach and speak and hear directly from survivors of failed government policies, and to learn about their experiences and implement their solutions for building a better Canada for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to continue my remarks on Bill C-8. So just to pick off where I left off, in the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's process on June 11, 2008, the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, Canada's 22nd Prime Minister, made a historic and symbolic statement of apology to former students of residential schools on behalf of the Government of Canada. On that day, back in 2008, I would have been in the midst of finishing my grade 12 exams, excitedly preparing to graduate from high school. Little did I know I would be revisiting the wise words of Canada's former Prime Minister in my very own speech on the House of Commons floor, albeit virtually, 12 and a half years later. Given today's debate centers on number 94 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, I feel that it is prudent to recognize and reaffirm some of the remarks of Canada's 22nd Prime Minister. He said, and to paraphrase, quote, 2 primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as it was famously said, to, quote, kill the Indian in the child. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policies were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks for the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly. We are sorry. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission presents a unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential school system. It will be a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians, a relationship based on the knowledge of our shared history, a respect for each other, and a desire to move forward together with a renewed understanding that strong families, strong communities, and vibrant cultures and traditions will contribute to a stronger Canada for all of us, end quote. Senator Murray Sinclair said that, quote, the apology was a momentous moment in the lives of the survivors and the Aboriginal community and Canadians as well. It was a recognition of the wrongs of the past, the fact that what was done and intended to be done was unacceptable. The apology was, for survivors of residential schools, finally a recognition that what they had been saying was right. It was finally a sense of validation about it. Madam Speaker, Conservatives believe that the fundamental obligation of the federal government is to improve the living conditions of Aboriginal Canadians, including the Inuit, in terms of economic opportunity, health, education, and community safety. And within that belief, the Conservative Party fully supports the treaty rights and process of reconciliation with Indigenous people, as well as real action to support clean water, safe housing, education, access to healthcare, and equitable economic opportunities. Conservatives understand the power of treaties among Canada's body of laws. And we support the resolution of unfulfilled treaty obligations in the process of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people. Historically, it was the government of former Conservative Prime Minister John Diefenbaker that was responsible for passing legislation that granted First Nations people the right to vote in Canada. Nearly 60 years later, our new Conservative leader made his commitment to Indigenous peoples during his campaign for the leadership of our party very clear. Specifically, our leader pledged that should he become Canada's Prime Minister, his government would, quote, will contribute to reconciliation based on the respect and the recognition that when Indigenous communities rise economically, all Canada rises, and that improving the relationship between the government and Indigenous communities must be a top priority. The future of our country depends on successful reconciliation and meaningful trust building, end quote. Additionally, related to the oath of citizenship, Conservatives have several guiding principles in our party's constitutional framework that supports the basis of all of our policy positions. One of these guiding principles is, quote, a belief in our constitutional monarchy, the institutions of Parliament, and the democratic process. With that guiding principle, we are pledging our support for the monarch of Canada, Queen Elizabeth II, and the Westminster-style democracy that governs our great country. As a result, we support the words affirming our allegiance to the Queen and her heirs and successors in our country's oath of citizenship. And in the context of our discussion today, it should be noted that there were several attempts in the 1990s by Liberal MPs, including cabinet ministers, to do away with centuries of historic tradition and development of our customs in our oath of citizenship. Thankfully, none of those attempts were successful. Further, Madam Speaker, the Liberal record of reconciliation with Indigenous people does not quite match their rhetoric during their time in government. During Prime Minister Stephen Harper's tenure, the Liberals voted against legislation to improve divorce and separation rights on reserves for Indigenous women. 3.5 years ago, our current Liberal Prime Minister said that, quote, no relationship is more important to Canada than the relationship with Indigenous peoples, and that his government was, quote, reviewing all federal laws and policies that concern Indigenous peoples and making progress on the calls to action outlined in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, in the 5 years since Liberals formed government, if Bill C-8 passes into law, it will represent only the 6th call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission fulfilled by this Prime Minister, and only the 10th overall in Canada. Although symbolic gestures such as changing the oath of citizenship are important, an argument could be made that with this bill, the Liberals are showing Canadians that they are choosing to focus on low-hanging fruit and avoid the calls to action that may be more challenging to implement. Moreover, the pandemic aside, 2020 has been a dismal year for this Liberal government's relationship with Indigenous peoples. 2020 began with an eruption across the country over the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Canadians experienced obstructive rail blockades that severely disrupted the flow of goods and people across our country. These events revealed cracks in this Liberal government's ability to mediate and support the economic development and success of Indigenous peoples. This week approach has been witnessed more recently during the fisheries crisis in Nova Scotia, which has seen violent protests erupt between commercial fish harvesters and First Nations. The safety of all Canadians must be the government's top priority, and it is clear that the Prime Minister and his government have failed to lead and take necessary action to prevent this eruption, and nor have they taken the long overdue mediation steps or ordered the RCMP to support the community in order to keep all Nova Scotians safe to the most of their ability in their communities and to peacefully resolve the situation. In conclusion, Conservatives strongly and proudly support Canada's traditions and institutions developed over centuries in our Westminster-style democracy. We also recognize the importance of the symbolism that represents our unique Canadian culture, which includes the symbolic gesture of the proposed amendment to the Oath of Citizenship. If passed into law, the new Oath of Citizenship will elevate and promote Indigenous rights, including treaty rights, as well as the inherent dignity of Indigenous peoples, a dignity that for so long was denied. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Nice to see you again. And I thank my colleague from Kildonan St. Paul for her speech. And I appreciate that she emphasized some of the other concrete actions we need to take to help support Indigenous communities and the everyday lives of Indigenous people beyond the scope of this proposal. So I'm wondering if she can expand more on that and speak about some of the further actions that the government must take in order to make true and meaningful reconciliation a reality.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question. I think that there's a lot more the government can do. I think it also involves encouraging Canadians across the spectrum to learn more about Indigenous history and the legacy left by residential schools, as per the leadership of the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. I also think that there are several, or in fact, all of them, in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action that should be studied and implemented accordingly as per the call to action and the findings of the TRC. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm inclined to disagree with the member when she tries to play down the importance that this government has placed on truth and reconciliation, as it has over the last number of years been very progressively moving forward on a number of fronts, whether it's language, whether just the other day talking about the statutory holiday. Today we're talking about citizenship. There is a number of calls for action. And, I'm very familiar with the apology that was provided by Prime Minister Harper, and it was very much appreciated. But I think the general consensus back today is that it means whole lot more to receive not only the apology, but to see things that would flow out of the apology, something in which this government actually has been delivering. Take a look, for example, at the advisories for water. And I'm wondering if she might want to revisit some of her thoughts.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member of Winnipeg North, and I'll remind him that it was, in fact, Prime Minister Harper that commissioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, in fact, Conservatives have a great record of acting on the needs of moving forward on Indigenous rights. And I will just also bring the House's attention to the 5 that his government has thus far implemented. They involve sports, as he mentioned, and support for the North American Indigenous Games, both very important. Federal support for the TRC, very important, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, and the federal acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights. So that's 5 out of 94, and I'll bring the member's attention to number 1 of the calls to action, which are the legacy of child welfare. And since the member is from Manitoba, as I am, he will know that over 10,000 children are in care in Manitoba, more than anywhere else in the world, and 97% are Indigenous. So I would draw his attention as a governing MP to number 1 and number 2 in the calls to action. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her comments. I particularly appreciate the fact that she expressed support on behalf of the Conservatives for this bill. Now, the member from Thornhill, in the last round, speaking about the proposed citizenship oath amendments, said that if Indigenous peoples continue their protest of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, that they would lose support for such an amendment. This kind of statement, of course, is completely ignorant of the rights of Indigenous peoples. If the Conservatives support the recognition of the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples as what it is proposed in this bill, would the Conservatives also support Article 10 of the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of free, prior, and informed consent?
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And I think in response, the member of Thornhill was referring to the public outcry of the railway blockades, but also referring to the immense support from the Wet'suwet'en elected band councils and some of their hereditary chiefs. For example, Hereditary Chief Helen Michelle mentioned that a lot of protesters are not even Wet'suwet'en. Our people said, go ahead to Coastal GasLink. Further, she said, we've talked with the elders. We talked and kept bringing them back, and we walk the very territory where Coastal GasLink is going. We're going to give it the go-ahead, she said. And further, Chief Larry Newski said, of the Nadel Wet'suwet'en, Coastal GasLink represents a once-in-a-generation economic development opportunity for the Nadel Wet'suwet'en First Nation. We negotiate hard to guarantee the Nadel people, including youth, have the opportunity to benefit directly and indirectly from the project, while at the same time ensuring the land and the water is protected. So I believe my colleague's response in his speech was regarding those comments. And further, regarding UNDRIP, Conservatives are supportive of the reconciliation of Indigenous people. And that path really must be, studied and further across all levels of government. And I would say that I'm eager to see what the government puts forward, if anything, as soon as possible. It's been 4 years since they said that they would adopt it, and yet no action has been brought forward. So again, an area that needs study, and I look forward to seeing that being studied. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie ma collègue pour son discours, collègue avec qui je siège sur le comité d'immigration. Je me demandais, dans la dernière législature, ses collègues avaient voté contre le principe de C-6. Donc, je me demandais si elle a une boule de cristal et si on peut espérer que pour les prochaines étapes du projet de loi, notamment la lecture en article par article en comité et le dernier vote, si elle sait déjà si à ce moment-là, il y aura du sable dans l'engrenage ou si on est automatiquement un peu plus sur la bonne voie qu'on l'était la dernière fois pour l'adoption du projet de loi.
The honourable member of Kildonan St. Paul.
I think the member was referring to Bill C-8. I think it was C-6 last Parliament. I'm not sure, but I'll speak to Bill C-8. Very much looking forward to this going to committee, Madam Speaker, and being studied to ensure that the wording is accurate and respectful. Again, I mentioned this when I questioned the minister on his remarks this earlier today about the use of the word Aboriginal versus Indigenous. I still have not received clarity from the Minister of Immigration of why specifically they decided to forego that word, which was in the TRC recommendations, and use sort of an older term that is no longer as socially acceptable, or at least that's what I was taught, being Aboriginal. So I just, that the Indigenous word is more acceptable, than the Aboriginal word. So I'm not sure, because I'd heard that from a Grand Chief in Manitoba, and I just want more clarity on that. So again, those are types of things that need to be studied in committee that I wish to seek greater clarity on, and very happy to support the bill as it is today as well. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I do want to pick up on the similar comments and speaking about how important it is that this gets to committee, and it's important that parliamentarians are able to do the work that we were sent here to do, examine this legislation and make sure that it is executed appropriately. I think it's interesting that my colleague from Kildonan St. Paul mentioned consultation with chiefs in Manitoba, and I've been doing many similar things in Kenora. I've been speaking with chiefs of the treaties in my riding, the Grand Chiefs, as well as the chiefs of the local communities and residents in the local communities, to get a sense of some of their thoughts on this proposal. And I'd like to know if the member for Kildonan St. Paul can share with us some of the thoughts that chiefs and community leaders in Manitoba have on this legislation.
The honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I think the member from Kenora for the question, and several things. What I've heard from my consultations with Indigenous leaders, specifically in Manitoba, is that when they travel abroad, for example, people don't know that Indigenous peoples exist in Canada. And so amending the citizenship oath to have mention of the Indigenous people and their treaty rights, and as well as the Métis and the Inuit, would mean a lot to the Indigenous community symbolically, and it would say to newcomers that, hey, there's Indigenous folks here, they're historical, they have dignity, we have respect for them. It would mean a lot in that symbolic sense. But beyond that, some of the feedback I did get was sort of what I acknowledged in my speech was, yeah, this is really great, this is important, symbolic gestures are important for moving forward, but there are a significant amount of issues that First Nations are facing, and the member from Kenora, mentioned today about a reserve in his riding that does not have running water. And we know that this is a rampant problem across Canada. We also know that suicide rates are extraordinarily and devastatingly high for First Nations on reserves. I've seen that firsthand and read about that firsthand in Manitoba. So I would just conclude with saying that there are much, much, much greater issues that the federal government is dragging its heels on and should focus on as well.